Hello students, welcome. Today we are going to talk about globalization and particularly media and globalization. Media actually plays a very interesting role in globalization. It is both a product of globalization as well as a facilitator of globalization. On these notes, we will venture in this particular lecture on how media is actually a product and how it is actually a facilitator of globalization. But before we venture into media and globalization, let's talk about what globalization means. Globalization is a modern term used to describe the changes in societies and the world economy that results from the rapid growth of international trade and cultural exchange. It describes the increase of trade and investing due to falling of barriers and the independence of countries. We can actually distinguish four main dimensions of globalization. And dimension is the correct word because these four dimensions, right, on the basis of which you can understand globalization are number one, technological, number two, economical, number three, political, and finally, number four, socio-cultural. Let's take each one of them one by one to understand what is globalization before we talk about media and globalization. Globalization and technology, of course, go hand in hand. In simple terms, remember the times when in order to make one STD call, you had to keep dialing up and there used to be an operator who used to say, now we are connecting you to a particular person in Delhi, right? And those were the times when globalization, of course, it's a long going process, but the world was not globalized in the manner in which it is today, and of course technology did play a major role. So going back to those times and comparing them to times today when, at the tip of a finger I can call up somebody who is abroad, America or Europe or anywhere in the world, right? I don't need any facilitators. So we have made this journey quite quickly, and of course, technology played a major role as a facilitator of globalization. Because what is globalization? It is coming together of the world. Instead of going into these complicated definition, I call globalization as where the world is coming together. The barriers being broken, and these barriers can be all sorts of barriers. These barriers are trade barriers. These barriers are the barriers where in terms of the flying time, which takes from going to one place to another. These barriers are communication barriers and so on and so forth. So the breaking away of these barriers is particularly what is known as globalization. This is understanding of globalization in simple terms. So globalization in the technological dimension is related to the development of global information system, which is facilitated by the use of technologies, and these technologies being communication satellites, these technologies being the internet, the information is at the palm of our hands, and of course wireless telephone, the first example I gave you. In fact, two of these are right in this table, which kind of facilitates globalization in the contemporary world, one being the cell phone and another being the World Wide Web. So globalization and technology. The next dimension is, of course, economical, right? And here we come to trade barriers. Before the opening up of the market in countries, so for example, in our case, in the case of India, it happened in 1991 when the markets opened up. But when a market is not opened to the world and there are extensive trade barriers, then it cannot facilitate globalization. So of course, globalization has an economic dimension. In the sense, let me give you a more simple example. Today, again, at the click of the hand, you can buy something which is not even available. So say it's available in America, and you can buy it from an American website, right? And it will be kind of sent across to your home. Back in the days when I was young, in order to buy a Vespa scooter at that point of time, which is not an Indian company, my family had to wait for 3 or 5 months, I don't remember particularly, for the scooter to be imported from some other country, right? So this was primarily the reason being that there were extensive trade barriers. Today, McDonald's, which is not even an Indian company, it's in Calcutta, it's actually everywhere. So this is what I mean by the economic dimension, and by economic, I particularly mean the opening up of the trade barriers and unification of the market, involving a wide variety of goods on a global common market. So today, the understanding of market has changed post globalization. It's very easy to sell your product in international market. That is what I mean by that is another dimension of globalization. Next, political globalization is often seen as a process of creating a world government. The political power, though, depends on the economic wealth of the country. As a result of globalization, international organizations such as World Bank, such as International Monetary Fund, IMF, World Trade Organizations have been created, right? So the government and the government policies being created, not particularly geared towards one particular country, but looking at the world as a whole, can be stated as the political dimension of globalization. And more we can see corporations between countries, right? Particularly in today's date, you saw when the war happened, that is the current war which is ongoing between Russia and Ukraine, how various countries came to its aid in terms of association and so on and so forth. So this itself is another dimension, of course, of globalization, and which we may refer as the political dimension of globalization, right? And the most important one is, of course, a cultural dimension. So globalization impacts the culture. Because what is happening is constantly you are now envisioning, and your sphere has broadened in terms of you are open to the culture of the world, culture of different countries, without actually going to this industry. And of course, this is where also media steps in a big way, of how globalization has opened up media markets, and therefore has kind of greatly it has greatly impacted socio-cultural it has greatly impacted the culture. Of course, you might say that it's very easy to now to go to America as well, or it's very easy to go to Europe as well, and then when you come back, you incorporate and you bring in their culture. So that's also part of globalization process. Migration is, of course, a very important aspect of globalization as well. But at the same point of time, media also is a facilitator here. Development of mass tourism, increased migration, which I was talking about, the commercialization of the cultural product, and the spread of the ideology of consumerism, all of this are particularly the socio-cultural dimension of globalization. So globalization is transforming the meaning of culture in today's world. Modern communication technologies have helped to spread some values across cultural boundaries and make them popular all over the world, often at the expense of the local ones. Many people fear that local culture will eventually fall victim to the Western ideas lying at the base of the global consumerism culture. On the other hand, the undisturbed transfer of cultural goods may promote multiculturalism and diversity of culture. This was particularly, whatever I read now, was with reference to globalization and culture. And you might be thinking of why I am particularly focusing on culture, is because this is where I believe, when in what I read, when we talk about crossing of cultural boundaries with the aid of communication technologies. So here the communication technology not only talks about telecommunication, but it also talks about the media. Media plays a very important role in this crossing of cultural boundaries, which thereafter leads to culture. Let me take example in order to explain globalization, and to some extent explain all these dimensions of globalization, and then connect it to media. Let us take the example of Hindi cinema, and let us take the example of liberalization, right? So what happens to our cinema, and what happens to our country? Let's see if we can take it. I'm going to take it as an example to explain you globalization. So earlier on, that is before the 1990s, our economy used to be a closed economy. What do you mean by a closed economy? So, of course, there was importing, even at that point of time, import and export. I mean, of course, it did take place, but it was not at the rate in which such current exchange goes on. So our market was closed as such, right? If I particularly talk about movies now, if we particularly talk about Hindi films now, during that point of time, so 70s was of course the great Amitabh Bachchan time, if you remember. Of course, before that, Raj Kapoor films were exported, and we have a lot of knowledge about how his films were kind of had a lot of were very popular in Russia and so on. But the export of films prior to 1990s was limited, and of course, in terms of import also, very rarely we could see Hollywood films. So this import and export was not very fervent prior to 1990s, right? Then comes the 1991, which is basically the time when liberalization occurred. What happened with liberalization? The term is actually LPG: liberalization, globalization, and privatization. When our economy was opened up, the reasons and so on, I'm not going into the details of LPG. Of course, you should read, because it's kind of one of the most remarkable thing which happened to us, and it kind of greatly impacted us in the sense, us Indians, in all aspects of our life, literally all aspects of our life, that is. So it's of course you should look into at great length on LPG. With the opening up of the market, just like all other products, and by all other products I mean pizzas, I mean Pizza Hut, I mean McDonald's, I mean all of these international brands suddenly poured, because the market opened up, right? And so Indian government made export easy, right? So the market opened up, and therefore all of these international goods, all of these international players kind of came to India to set their shops up. I have a small quiz for you. That is, you should now note down all of these aspects of globalization and then connect it to India and how India was impacted with globalization, with 1990s affair, that is the opening up of the economy, which I was just talking about. Welcome back. Let's take it up from the point where we were talking about Hindi cinema and globalization. What happens to the world of Hindi cinema post globalization for us? And for us, I mean post 1990s. Now, with the opening up of the economy, Hindi films started being exported globally, right? So its world market expanded. And at this point of time, some of the key markets for Hindi films were US and UK. So, if you go back to the kind of films being made and produced during 1990s, suddenly we see an overbearing presence of the NRI, that is the non-resident Indian, in our films, right? The quintessential NRI hero being played by the very famous superstar Shah Rukh Khan. However, we should not forget that this is also the same point of time when, particularly post 2000 onwards, where Hollywood films started being imported to India as well. So, two things happened as a result of this. One was that a sense of competition was there, right? So, Bollywood, that is a Hindi cinema, and of course being referred as Bollywood post 1990s because of a certain kind of narrative. And of course, this certain kind of narrative is the NRI overbearing narrative. But at this point of time, Bollywood had strong competition with the Hollywood films, right? With the international market. International films, and particularly American films. When I say international films, particularly Hollywood films, which were now being imported to India. in terms of export, of course our export rise, but as because the export was on rise, and of course because when somebody was watching a Hindi cinema, when somebody was watching a Bollywood film abroad, they were paying in dollars instead of rupee, right? More money was being amassed through the overseas trade, and we slowly see a rapid rise in the kind of the rapid rise in the NRI presence in our films. Now that this is all the economics, and you might say this is all the trade which was happening in Hindi cinema. But how is it related to? Now let's look at how does it impact culture, because that's what we were initially talking about. That media, globalization impacts media, and therefore media then impacts culture. So what happens culturally at this point of time? Now outside the ambit of media also, of course, globalization itself impacted culture. Why? Because as I was giving examples of Pizza Hut, or we started having malls in our market, so all the international brands started pouring in Indian market, and which ultimately led to consumerism. So consumerism is, of course, one of the most important result of globalization or globalized culture, so as to say. So there was this overpowering need amongst us to, grab all these new things and new cool, zesty things which were there in the market, right? So that's, of course, very important. That was there. The ads in the TV were now showing all the international products and so on and so forth. But also, how media fueled onto this was that this new quintessential, hero who, even though, sometimes he was not an NRI, but at least he felt and looked like an NRI, who seemed like being an NRI is a very cool factor. He was suddenly wearing a Gap t-shirt, right? Or he was suddenly wearing clothes which were all international brands. Now, this all the more made us want to buy those clothes, or made us all the more wanted to be a part of that culture. So suddenly having a Coca-Cola, which is of course an international brand, or a Pepsi became cool. And who made this cool? Shah Rukh Khan made it cool for us, right? The movies in the 1990s made it cool for us, particularly which is referred as Bollywood made it cool for us, right? So this is how it percolated down. Something which was completely a trade which happened, opening up of trade barriers which had nothing to do with culture happened, right? As a result of which, the culture being impacted, media being a facilitator among the same. So media's role as facilitator kind of geared up at this point of time, facilitator of the kind of culture which was important for globalization to flourish, a kind of culture which which was required for consumerism to flourish, right? So it kind of created a sort of culture where inherently we just needed to buy more, buy and buy more and more. Because prior to 1990s, if we talk about culture and if we talk about of India, it was primarily roti kapra makan, right? What I usually say. It's basically a need-based culture which was there prior to 1990s. But post 1990s, we kind of changed. We took that pathway from roti kapra makan to buying more and more. We didn't mind paying a 2,000 or a 3,000 rupees or whatever for a Nike shoe, right? Which maybe people of earlier generation were very hesitant to spend that sort of amount of humongous money to buy something. This change kind of came along with globalization, if we talk particularly about the culture and media. I gave you the example of films, right, with heroes like Shah Rukh Khan and so on and so forth, with their famous, not only their films, you have to remember that at this point of time, there were a lot of ad films as well, which kind of created an aspirational culture, right? So the ads or the movies of 1990s were all aspirational in nature. It was all about getting the next new thing. It was all about being cool. Yeah, it was all about grabbing that Pepsi bottle or grabbing that chips, even though it was it forget about the money which went behind. So it was not about thinking about the cost of it. And this is what consumerist culture is all about, right? So this is what kind of media did, being a facilitator of the global culture. Also, at this point of time, early on, we were not only looking at content from India, as I said, that you cannot forget that this is the also the point of time when Hollywood films are being imported to India. And this is all, I'm still talking about films, but what about television? Right? Television, earlier we had one channel, which was only Doordarshan. From Doordarshan, we came to Star, right? Which belongs to the Rupert Murdoch network, right? Star and of course Z was an Indian company, but so on and so forth. So what happened, television also opened a whole new world to us, and we were not watching only content which was Indian content, but we were watching content which was created across the world. Now, this sort of created, apart from the consumerist culture, which we just spoke about, which is inherently an aspect of globalization, it also created a multicultural societies, right? Multicultural. So what happened? And of course, even outside the ambit of media, a sort of multiculturalist tendency was there. So you have right now in Calcutta, even at that point of time, early on in the late 1990s, you have Japanese restaurant, you have American restaurants. You could eat a steak, or you have restaurants, you have food from across the world in your own city. This is called what? This is called multicultural, right? You're not limited to one culture at all. So from monoculture, right? So which is culture of one country to a sort of multiculture. And of course, this multiculture was also propagated, was also propelled by, because you're looking at the culture, you're looking at the world of all of these different cultures, different societies, Japanese or American and Russian and so on. You're looking at all of these, culture of these countries across in your television, either via the television content or via the movies. And then you are, of course, you're heading out and then grabbing that McDonald's, which is completely very alienated and which is very, very different from the Indian culture, which you are kind of used to at this point of time. This is how media content became a facilitator. Now, I want you to take 2 minutes and again think about what will be the meaning of the global culture. What is the impact of this global culture? Think about it, and we'll continue it from here. Welcome back, students. And let's begin this last section by talking about communication. How communication has actually changed. So, we spoke about movies, of course, we spoke about television content, of course, but there is another thing which we are missing out, that is World Wide Web, the internet. The advent of the internet has created opportunities for easy and nearly instantaneous communication. I can write an email right away. I can, of course, text as well, right? And all of this is an example of instant communication. Again, it's a result of globalization. Of course, you can say it's a result of technology, but these ideas cannot be separated as such. Technology leads to globalization, globalization leads to advent of more technological advancement. So it's both ways. A low-cost global communication tool is now being used for more than 300 million people. The internet is associated with the process of cultural globalization because it allows interaction and communication between people with very different lifestyles and from very different cultures. Of course, this was also true for television. This was, of course, true for movies as well. But internet did something magical. It kind of opened up the world to us, and you cannot deny it. It offers multiple platforms for people to connect, that is social networking websites such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, video sharing. I mean, we know how much we look at the videos of around the globe, videos containing of ideas and thoughts and, visuals of around the globe in YouTube. So YouTube also, plays a very, very important role in globalization. Professional networking sites such as LinkedIn and so on and so forth. Their popularity is also a cultural phenomenon which is stretching across the globe. And all of this together, so be it the movies or be it be it the television content, and of course the internet, YouTube, all of this is kind of geared towards creating one particular kind of culture, a culture which is not does not belong to a particular nation, or a culture which does not belong to a particular category or community. It rather can be referred as the global culture. And with the expansion of communication networks, that is, and the instantaneous movement of information, quickly your information is being transferred at the, you don't need to you can scroll information, you can look at the cultures across the globe just by scrolling your phone. So that's what has happened with globalization, and this has all led to creation of a global village. Many people fear that globalization of culture may be a threat to the diversity of culture, which is true, and which is kind of a fear which a lot of nationalist cultures are dealing with. That is evasion, which is completely that, like a local culture might be completely forgotten soon with the implosion of the global culture, and that's a valid concern. So a lot of governments, including Indian government, is trying its best to kind of pay heed to the local cultures, to Indian values and Indian culture, and so on and so forth. However, this outburst of global culture which we are seeing in today's date also cannot be denied. I mean, as globalization will progress, it's kind of a constant process. The proponent of globalization at this point points out that no matter how hard we'll try, a global culture will develop eventually, and that's kind of will be an hallmark of progression as well. What is more, global communication media may ensure access to cultural diversity on one hand, and the opportunity to enhance multiculturalism by spreading one's value across the globe. So, a multicultural global culture is what we are looking at in this point of time as a result of globalization, with media, and I emphasize on this, with media being a facilitator of this global culture. The question whether local cultures will be undermined by this global consumer monoculture which we are dealing with in today's date is a big question mark. However, these are things which, as the world progresses, we are yet to envision, but what slowly, and we are kind of heading towards definitely a sort of monolithic global culture. Thank you. See you in the next lecture.